So hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Claire Byrne, and I'm the Community Manager for RSA US. So on behalf of Christian, Joan, and the RSA US, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this month's US Salon, navigating the unknown, turning the unexpected from a threat into an ally. Obviously, I've got a lot of high energy today. I'm very excited about this event. Having worked with both Christian and Joan before, I'm really excited for the conversation. But before I kick things off, I'd just like to give you a little bit of a background on the RSA, RSA US, and just some ground rules about today's event, just before we jump right in. So founded in the UK, we are the Royal Society for the Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, and have been uniting people and ideas to resolve the challenges of our time since 1754. Today, the Society exists as an international fellowship-driven social change organization, and we're committed to a world that is resilient, rebalanced, and regenerative, where everyone can fulfill their potential. Our proven change process, rigorous research, innovative ideas platforms, and unique global network of 30,000 change makers work collectively to enable people, places, and the planet to flourish. And of the 30,000 fellows spread out around the globe, about 1,100 live and work here in the US, including both Christian and Joan. RSA US exists to coordinate fellowship activities in the US with an aim towards moving the needle on addressing the inequities of our society. Before I turn things over to our wonderful speakers, Christian and Joan, today, I'd just like to cover a couple of different ground rules for today's event. So you can see them just on your screen. And as I said many times, this event is being recorded. So you'll be able to access the playback and have a look, hopefully tomorrow. So if you miss anything, fear not. So this is an informal and an inclusive space. And we do really welcome lots of conversation, lots of questions, lots of feedback, and hopefully a really interesting chat along the way. Please be respectful and use language your mother or your mum would approve of. I don't have any shame in booting people out if they don't. Or as we'd say in Ireland, language that your mum would approve of. And this is, like our salons are very collaborative. They're very informal spaces for conversation and debate. So just please bring that mindset to this event and not monopolize the conversation or use any judgment statements. And we just also ask to please respect each other's times, boundaries and feedback. Time is our most valuable resource, and we're all here for a great reason and to have a great conversation. So the chat is available for you to raise points of clarification. No question is a silly question. Feel free to DM me at the general RSA US handle, or you can message me at Claire as well there. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to help you. And without further ado, I just want to introduce you to our speakers. Some lovely pictures there of both Christian and Joan, and delighted to have them with us for today's event. And just before I kind of get into a little bit more about Christian and Joan, it'd be really great to kind of get a sense of, in the chat, if you want to pop in your answers to how you think we can see and leverage the value in the unknown. So while I intro our speakers, I will just pop that in the chat to just get us into the right headspace for today's event. And feel free to pop your answers there in the chat as we go. So Dr. Christian Busch FRSA is the best-selling author of the Serendipity Mindset, which is a wise, exciting, and life-changing book, according to Arianna Huffington, that provides excellent practical guidance for all, according to Paul Pullman, former CEO of Unilever. He is the director of the CGA Global Economy Program at NYU, and he also teaches at the London School of Economics. He is the co-founder of Leaders on Purpose and the Sandbox Network, and a former co-director of LSE's Innovation Lab. He has worked with senior executives and governments around the world, and he's a member of the World Economic Forum Expert Forum. He is a fellow of the RSA and on the Thinkers 50 radar list of the 30 thinkers most likely to shape the future. And his work has been featured by outlets such as, oh my gosh, put my tea back in today, as the Strategic Management Journal, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and the BBC. He has received his PhD from the LSE, and you can find Christian on Twitter at Chris Serendip. And I'll be popping relevant social media handles in the chat later on. And over to Joan. Joan P. Ball is the author of Stop, Ask, Explore, Learn to Navigate Change in Times of Uncertainty. Also Associate Professor of Marketing at the Tobin College of Business at St. John's University, and founder of Womb Lab, a transition services consultancy. Her work lives in the tricky space between ambition, impact, and well-being at a time when persistent change forces us to reimagine what it means to live meaningful and successful lives in new and dynamic circumstances. So you can find Joan on Twitter at Joan P. Ball. And so enough of me chatting. I really want to pass over to our speakers for today's event. So I'm just going to make sure that they are spotlit there, and you can see both Joan and Christian. And also, in case you're wondering, these are copies of their book, which I will also share details of at the end of today's event. So enough from me, over to Joan and Christian, and thank you all so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Claire. I would usually say, of course, Joan first, but I think we agreed that I would start. So I'm taking it off from here, and it's wonderful to be here with everyone today. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here. And as mentioned, please do put in the chat at any given time any ideas, thoughts, questions. I'm a big believer that most of the knowledge usually is in the room rather than in the head of the presenter. So delighted to make that as much of a conversation as possible. What I'd love to talk about really is how do we turn the unexpected from a threat into serendipity, this unexpected good luck. And before doing that, a quick question in the room, please, if you can put in the chat, who of you considers yourself to be a lucky person? Please, if you put, who of you considers yourself to be a lucky person? Don't worry, I don't ask the unlucky ones, just the lucky ones. If you can please put it in the room, just so we get a feeling for the room itself. Seems like, oh, wonderful, I love it. Vanessa says, oh, Gigi says, I create luck. That's fantastic. Cindy attracts luck. Enrique depends. So sometimes yes, sometimes no. Rick, yes. Leanne, yes. RSA, pretty lucky. I assume, Claire, that's you, pretty lucky. The luck of the Irish, of course, in the room. Wonderful. So I will come back to that question in a bit, and we'll talk a little bit about how those of you who consider yourself to be lucky tend to be luckier in the future, not because of some kind of abracadabra, it falls from the sky into your lap, but because of the way you look at the world. And I'll come back to that in a second. But for now, I really want to talk about this idea that often we look at the unexpected as something that's a threat that kind of interrupts our plans. We might kind of imagine you cross the streets and you have the green lights, but you might still look left and right because sometimes cars might not stop, or especially here in New York, bikes might just not stop. So they might just kind of run over. So in a way, you're sometimes prepared for the negatively unexpected. But what if we would do the same for the positively unexpected, to open our eyes more to the positively unexpected? And that's really where a lot of that serendipity that we'll talk about comes from. To give you a bit of context before diving into this, I grew up in Heidelberg in Germany, where we have a philosopher's way. You'll see that a lot of my thoughts are quite philosophically motivated as well. And so I grew up there, was thrown out of school, had to repeat a year, probably held the unofficial world record of how many dustbins you can knock over on your way to school when you're driving. And then one day I wasn't so lucky anymore, crashed into 4 parked cars, all cars completely destroyed, including my own. And I won't forget the policeman who came to the scene, and he was like, oh my God, he's still alive. And that idea that I was supposed to be dead, that stuck with me. And I asked myself all these weird questions, if I would have died, who would have come to my funeral? Who would have actually cared? Was it all worth it? And at that point, I had mostly depressing answers. And so it took me on this intense search for meaning, trying to figure out, what is this all about? What is life all about? And I started reading an amazing book that I highly recommend, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is all about the question of how do we find meaning in tough situations? How do we find meaning in crisis? And when reading that book, what I realized is, well, I find a lot of meaning in connecting ideas, connecting people, and the sparks that come from doing that. And so, I started out as community builder, went more into entrepreneurship, and then later into academia. And what I found fascinating on this journey is that the most joyful, inspiring, successful people around me, they seem to have something in common, which is that they somehow intuitively cultivate serendipity. They are a little bit luckier, even though they are in exactly the same situations as others. And that's a really important point, right? That there's a lot of inequality in the world, of course, that's based on this kind of blind luck, right? People being born into better families or better off families or things like that. Not much like that we as an individual can do about that initial blind luck, the lottery luck that in a way then we have to work on as well these structural inequalities. And then at the same time, there's the mindset that's about the serendipity, that is about active luck. And that's really what I want to talk about. How do we create that active luck where when we're in exactly the same situation, some people create a little bit more luck than others. And so before talking about this, a quick example maybe to make sure we're on the same page what serendipity is. And I'm sure all of you have had it, right? You might have found love that way, unexpectedly so, or your co-founder or your job. But so one of my favorite examples is the potato washing machine, where a couple of years ago, a company in China called Haier, they produce washing machines, refrigerators, and they received calls from farmers. And the farmers told them, your crappy washing machine is always breaking down. Why is the washing machine breaking down? Well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in it, and it doesn't seem to work. What would we usually do? We'd probably say, that's not part of our plan that you wash your potatoes in there. Our marketing plan says that you should wash your clothes. Now, they did the opposite. They said, you know what, that's unexpected, but there's probably a lot of farmers in China and in the world who have a similar problem. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? That's how the potato washing machine became one of their products. They saw something in the unexpected moment. They saw that unexpected event, but they said, can I do something with it? Can I instill some meaning in this moment? And that's what serendipity is about. It's about making accidents meaningful and potentially, as we'll talk about, creating more meaningful accidents. So what are some practices we can use to do that? One practice that I've seen, especially in our research with senior leaders, is that they're extremely good at saying, I cannot give you certainty. We live in a world where I cannot give you extreme absolute certainty. That would be a lie, but I can give you clarity. Here's a way, like this is a sense of orientation. If I'm MasterCard and I'm the CEO, we want to get 500 million people into the financial system who were previously unbanked. Now we know where we're going as an organization. Here's a strategy how we do it. But I'm telling you already now that as we learn new information, as if Hilda in Cape Town tells us that our card doesn't work in her context, we will adjust. And that is part of our plan. And so what they're doing is they're building the unexpected into their planning. And instead of seeing it as a loss of control or as something that is threatening their plans, they see unexpected moments as sources of innovation, as new ideas and everything that comes with it. So that's really about the culture for then innovation and for insights that they're creating. There's simple ways, for example, in the weekly meetings to ask people, what surprised you last week? It's a simple question, but if you ask people what surprised you last week, you're legitimizing the idea that people should look out for that customers might have washed their potatoes in the washing machine, or that your kids might have had a new insight that they didn't even know is interesting, but now they can share it with you. So it's really kind of asking people about surprising things that then legitimizes the unexpected as a source of delight of something interesting that could happen in their lives. A second practice is really the idea that a lot of times serendipity in our life could have happened, but it didn't because something held us back, right? Self-limiting beliefs. So if you look back in your life where maybe there were incidences where maybe you were in a meeting and you had this brilliant, unexpected idea, but you didn't bring it into the meeting because you didn't feel worthy, ready, you name it. And, then you walked outside and you thought, what could have happened had I spoken up, had I brought in that idea? Or you might have run into this amazing speaker at a conference, but then you didn't speak to them because you didn't feel, you wanted to bother them or ready or worthy, or you name it. And then you walked outside and you thought, what could have happened had I spoken with a person? And so when you look at all these incidences in your life where serendipity could have happened, but it didn't because you held yourself back, trying to understand what is the pattern behind this? Is it imposter syndrome, right? When I'm in room with senior executives, up to 60, 70, 80%, when I ask who of you considers yourself to be an imposter syndrome beholden person has a little bit of imposter syndrome, which is a lot of times, right, a characteristic of high achievers, that you're growing so fast that in a way you always feel, oh my God, hopefully nobody figures out that I'm not as smart as they all think I am. But also you work harder then, right? Because you're like, okay, now I gotta prove that works. And so the question always is, how do we channel these things? Imposter syndrome, fear of rejection, you name it, and can we turn that into a superpower rather than something that holds us back? Something that helped me, for example, a lot there was to say, rather than always thinking about what's the worst thing that can happen if I do it? So what's the worst thing that if I bring an idea into a meeting, the worst thing is it gets shot down, I'm the loser who had like an imperfect idea, things like that. Well, but maybe that's not the worst thing. That's kind of sting of rejection. Maybe the worst thing is that regret, that when you walk outside the room and you think what could have happened. And so that simple reframing from what's the worst thing that can happen if I do it, to what's the worst thing that can happen if I don't do it actually then does wonders towards developing that bias for action and to saying, okay, maybe I should act more on those kind of unexpected events that could become positive if I do something with it. Third strategy, my absolute favorite actually in terms of strategies, is the hook strategy. And the hook strategy is about the idea that we can create positive coincidences in the way that, positive coincidences a lot of times are about probability, right? If we put ourselves more into environments where positive people are that work on similar things but have different ideas, makes it more likely that serendipity happens. And the same is, how do we engage with people? And the hook strategy is about saying, how can I, in every interaction or conversation or meeting, see the couple of interesting points where other people can connect the dots with? So, for example, someone who does that really well is Ollie Barrett. He's an entrepreneur in London. And if you would ask him at an event this dreaded "what do you do" question, right, that we all get and puts people into boxes, he wouldn't just say, "I'm an entrepreneur." He would say something like, "I'm an entrepreneur, recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano." And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks where you could be like, "Oh my God, such a coincidence. My CEO is hosting piano sessions. You should stop by. Oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister's teaching on the philosophy of science at LZ. You should give a guest lecture." The point is that we can all think about what are 2 or 3 things that are important to me at the moment, or curiosities I want to develop, and then just seed them as side notes into conversations. And from the most unexpected of places, people usually connect the dots, and kind of these unexpected coincidences start to happen more and more and more. And the last strategy, and I'd be delighted to talk about more strategies, but for the sake of time, I really kind of want to keep it to one last one, which is really the idea of, we need to open our eyes to the positively unexpected. If we don't expect that there could be something positively unexpected, we tend to not see it as often. What do I mean with this? So I asked you earlier, do you consider yourself to be a lucky person? And there's a lot of experiments around this kind of lucky, unlucky idea. And one of my favorites is an experiment where they pick people who consider themselves to be very unlucky and people who consider themselves to be very lucky. So the unlucky people would be people who would say, "I'm always in accidents, bad things always happen to me," and so on. And the lucky people more like, "Oh, good things tend to happen to me," and so on. And we probably all know people on this continuum from like very lucky to very unlucky. Again, within the same social strata. We're not talking about the societal inequality piece here, which I think is extremely important. But this is really people who are in exactly the same situations as a starting position. And so then they pick one person who identifies as very lucky and one person who identifies as very unlucky. And they say, walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, grab a coffee, sit down, and then we'll have our conversation. What they don't tell them is that there's hidden cameras alongside the street and inside the coffee shop. There's money, I think 5 or 10 pound note right in front of the coffee shop door. And inside the coffee shop, there's this empty seat next to the counter that's next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big dreams happen. Now, lucky person walks down the street, sees the 5 pound note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders a coffee, sits next to the businessman, they have a conversation, they exchange business cards, potentially an opportunity coming out of it, we don't know that part. The unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the 5 pound note, so doesn't see it, goes inside the shop, orders a coffee, sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, and that's it. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, "How was your day today?" So the lucky person says, "Well, it was amazing. I found money in the street, made new friends, and potentially an opportunity coming out of it." The unlucky person just says, "No, nothing really happened." And the point here is you can put people into exactly the same situation where there's potentiality. So things that could potentially happen, but only some of them will see them. Kids find more money in the street usually than parents. Why? Because they don't expect it to not be there. I find money in the street because I expect it to be there. People drop a lot of pennies, unfortunately, mostly pennies and cents, so it doesn't really change my lifestyle. But actually, people drop a lot of kind of small coins, but if we don't look for them, we will not see them. And so the point really is, yes, serendipity a lot of times comes from interaction, right? So extroverts might benefit from talking with the businessman, and it might come easier to them. But there's a lot of hope for closet introverts like myself that serendipity comes from quiet sources. It comes from reading a book and thinking, "Oh my God, that could be a podcast that I could create out of this." It comes from watching a movie and thinking, "Oh my God, this could be a business idea." And so serendipity is hidden everywhere, and everyone has a lot of hope to find it once we open our eyes to it. And so to wrap this up, I told you I have a slightly philosophical modality, and so I want to wrap up with the idea of Viktor Frankl, that he never said that exact sentence, but it was his spirit to say that you can't always pick the situation, but you can always pick your response to it, and that's where your agency is. That's where your freedom lies, and that's where I might add your serendipity lies, because a lot of times objectively a situation might not make sense, right? Viktor Frankl was in a concentration camp, which, as you can imagine, is the toughest of situations, and objectively there's no meaning from his perspective. But then he said, then I will create some meaning out of this. I will still speak with other prisoners tomorrow to make them feel better. And by doing this, now I have a reason to wake up tomorrow morning. Now I have created a subjective meaning in that moment. And that is where a lot of times serendipity comes from, to say, even in crisis moments, can I see something meaningful in here? Can I make an accident meaningful in some way or the other, and then connect the dots and do something with it? And that comes back to Heidelberg, where Goethe used to say that if you take someone as they are, you make them worse. But if you take them as what they could be, you make them capable of becoming what they can be. And that's really what serendipity is about. It's about potentiality. It's about seeing a little bit more in a situation, especially unexpected situations, and then imbuing meaning in them and turning them into positive outcomes. And with this, thank you so very much. I'm looking forward to our conversation, and I'm handing over back, I think, to Joanne.
Thank you so much for that. I know that Joan might be queuing up some slides, so I'll give you just a sec to sort yourself out. Or you're not, okay. But I just wanted to say, if you have any questions before Joan kicks off, like, feel free to pop them in the chat and I'll capture them at the end. I think we've got lots of food for thought with that. So thank you so much, Christian. And over to you, Joan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I do have one slide that's coming to mind based upon what we're talking about. I may or may not pull it up, but I'd just like to begin just chatting a little bit. It's first of all, Christian, thank you so much for that. It's interesting how much our work intersects, but in different ways. And so a lot of the things that you talked about, I found myself kind of putting little Post-its up on my computer in front of me. You talked about active luck, and I talk about active resilience, and you talk about the positive and negative unexpected. That's a big part of my work as well. And you talk, quite interestingly, that idea of seeing interruptions and disruptions as a threat versus a source of innovation. And right there is probably the heart and the soul of my interest, is in that moment, right? Of this idea of, how do we think about that in action, right? So I think that, just by way of giving a little background on my work, what I do, and how it enters into this conversation, I really started not thinking about wayfinding, not necessarily thinking about points of inflection and so on and so forth. My work really began in looking at stuckness. It was probably 12 or 13 years ago now, where I was noticing in people who were confident and educated and ambitious, this stuckness that they were describing to me. I was having people come to me. It was, some of them were my graduating students who were stuck on leaving college and going into career and doing their early career. It was many times women who were adding family into the mix of their career. It was the media talking about millennials failing to launch, if you remember, when that was very popular to talk about. And it just, the reasons that were being given for this millennial failing to launch, for instance, oh, they're hover parented and were over coddled and so on and so forth. And I just wasn't seeing it. That was not what I was seeing in the young people who I was dealing with. And so I was seeing the failure to launch. They were seeing it. They were saying that there were certain things that they wanted to get on with that they were having problems getting on with. But that reason that it was that they were not applying themselves somehow, that it was some kind of a personal problem that they had that was getting in their way, wasn't jiving with my observation. So I just started to try to understand, why are people stuck and how might I help? And so the kind of research that I do is action research, participatory action research. So I get the opportunity to actually be able to get out into those systems and deal with those inequities and so on and so forth, and really say, okay, these individuals are stuck, so how might I engage? And the more that I looked at it, there were some obvious things, right? Resources, or, that people didn't have, some kind of a contact or a network or whatever it might be. But also what I started to see was at points of inflection when people were interrupted or disrupted, whether it was positive or negative, this directional challenge of I'm not sure where to go next. I don't know, kind of that navigational, directional sense of what even success looks like, what kind of a life that I want to have, et cetera. And I'm born in the latter part of the 60s. So I would fall into Generation X. If you're a generational person, there's a lot there that can be questioned, but we'll use it for a grounding point. And so at the beginning of my career, I had a lot of uncertainty, but that directional notion wasn't a big problem, right? You kind of went to school for something and then you went into a career, and the notion of jumping between careers was not something that we really encountered. And the more I looked at it, the more I saw that there was a real cultural shift that we were underestimating in these young people who had many different choices, many different possibilities. And now we know there's ample research to show how difficult it is to make choices when you have many of them. And so here they were having a variety of choices, a large locus of possibilities, and they were having trouble making sense of, and we kept calling it things like FOMO, right? The whole kind of FOMO concept points to this, of this idea of, well, if I make this choice, if I go down this road, there are 5 other roads and routes that I might be able to take. And it was more than career. The more I spoke to people, the more I got kind of deeply into the experiences that they were having in the world, it was obvious that it wasn't just, what career do I have and which direction do I go? Because that's not new. It was also, will I ever get married? Do I not get married? Do I have a child? Do I have a child on my own? Do I have a child with someone else? Do I freeze my eggs so that I can have a child later? Right? There are so many different kinds of choices about lives and lifestyles that we have because of the technology that exists, because of the medical technology that we have, and because social norms and what it looks like to do it right have also eroded, right? So this idea that there is a set way to do it and a set route that you are either following the norm or you are diverging from the norm has gone away. And so the good news is uncharted territory, open terrain, right? You can actually pave and chart your own course in whatever way you want. You can work for a company. You can create your own company, right? These things are much, much easier now, even if you're under-resourced. Whereas there was a time that if you were starting your own company, you needed to build a factory to start your own company. And as a result, you needed to be highly resourced to be able to open a factory, right? So there are so many different, and it's happened so quickly, and it's happened so kind of methodically over time. It wasn't a big disruption that we've underestimated, at least my research suggests that we've underestimated how making one's way when we have multiple opportunities to go in different directions can be both liberating and debilitating, depending upon what our resources are for sense making and discernment in that kind of an environment. And so this idea of what happens at these moments, right? This idea that Christian was talking about of making accidents meaningful, making interruptions and disruptions not feel like threat, moving into an innovation mindset at the point that we have that kind of an interruption or disruption is wonderful as an ideal. And I support Christian 100% in that ideal. However, working one-on-one with now many hundreds of people and in cohorts and in groups and in all kinds of different settings, working with people who are highly educated and people who have GEDs for people who are in other parts of the world who didn't finish primary school and then just kind of tested. There is this remarkable uniformity in the way that people respond when they have the kind of interruption or disruption that makes them feel disoriented and calls into question either their self-direction or their identity. So it's not every interruption or disruption that sends people into what I call in my work a what now moment. how I define a what now moment is one where we've had an interruption or disruption, positive or negative, that we process as threat, right? So the ideal is that we don't process interruptions and disruptions as a threat. But the reality is that we do, right? Some of them feel like threat. Some of them process like threat, right? And so I became intensely interested in, so what is happening at that point of impact when we have a what now moment, an interruption or disruption that processes as threat? And how do we actually equip ourselves before, during, and after to do what Christian's work is calling us to do, which is not internalize that threat and remain in the threat response when it happens, but actually, and with intention, move from that threat response into a more curious. I don't focus on serendipity in the same way. Curiosity is the variable that has attracted me into this. And I believe that curiosity of walking around thinking that you might find money on the ground is similar, right? So that's why I say there's overlaps here, even though we look at it through, different lenses a little bit. But this notion that we will have interruptions and disruptions that process as threat, right? It may not always be helpful to us, but the notion that we can simply become people who have a different mindset that suddenly makes it that we never feel threat. I know that's not what Christian is suggesting, or anyone who gives us these kind of ideal states that we should be in. My interest, both as a researcher and as a practitioner, is, but then what do we do when we haven't achieved that kind of perfection? What does the day-to-day life look like when you have the what now moment and now you're in threat? And so this idea of actually thinking about preparing for it, the reason that the book that I wrote about this is called Stop, Ask, Explore, is because certainly in my culture, and I did some research in many cultures in the world, if you think about when you were children and you were taught about fire safety, in many cultures, we're taught to stop, drop, and roll if something were to happen to us in a fire, if our clothing went on fire, right? And there's a lot of history of why we stop, drop, and roll and why we're taught that. But the reason that we're taught to do that and it's kind of drilled into our minds is because the time to think about what you should do when your clothing is on fire is not while your clothing is on fire. And unfortunately, if we draw upon that and we think about it when we have the incendiary emotions that also often come up when we have something that processes to us as a threat, we do very, very little preparation in advance for that happening. And so we wind up in a situation that we naturally wind up having the new, the uncertain, even when it's positive, process with us as, and this is that fear of change that we have very often, is that when a change is presented to us, the first thoughts that we have is, where is this threatening to me? And so we kind of operate in that space. So the notion that we should stop and then open up inquiry points us, it's actually a practice, right? It's not an ideal or a mindset. It's a practice that we can draw upon because we may indeed need to navigate uncertain transitions while we're still feeling in threat, while we're still afraid. We might need to get curious as an act of will, not necessarily as a feeling that we have. And so the notion of developing our practices prior to having some kind of an interruption or disruption as a means for us to create our own toolbox for moving into this kind of curiosity that might lead to the kind of serendipity that Christian is talking about is a set of practices that my research suggests is incredibly, incredibly under-researched and under-practiced. And in many cases, it's because we like a pivot metaphor, right? We prefer a pivot metaphor where it's like something's going to happen and then we're going to zig and zag forward. We're going to learn by failure and we're going to learn by doing, which is wonderful, except for a lot of people learning by failure. If you don't have, I don't know, $20 million worth of VC funding behind you to kind of fail forward with on a day-to-day basis, that's very, very challenging for people. And so when I point to wayfinding, it's really this question of engaging with people and inviting people to engage with themselves, about having a level of rigorous self-awareness to understand, well, where are the areas where I am most likely to feel threatened and vulnerable when I have some kind of an interruption or disruption in that area, and to know it beforehand so that when we're entering into circumstances where we might have that vulnerability tested, that we can be bringing all of the resources that we've gathered beforehand into those kind of situations. And then once we've kind of tempered that incendiary emotion, how do we develop what I call a dispassionate curiosity about what's next? How do we temper the emotion as kind of a decision, a choice, even if we're still feeling that feeling in the chest, the feeling in the stomach, whatever it might be, that's your own kind of response in that way. And how do you equip for it beforehand so that you have a set of, your own stop, drop, and roll, your own stop, ask, explore, so that you can know that your first step, and very quickly, because I do want to get us into conversation, I think that the response to COVID was quite interesting in this context. I had a lot of people who I had been working with for 2 or 3 years prior to COVID who called me in those early days to thank me, actually, to say, we have no idea what we're supposed to do now. We have no idea where we're going. We have no context for this situation. So we are absolutely in a what now moment. But because we've been using this language for 2 or 3 years as a team, because we recognize that these kind of interruptions open up a transitional learning space for us, liminal space, a third space from I knew what to do yesterday, I will know what to do at some point in the future. But opening up a territory, rather than trying to pivot, opening up territory to be able to explore. They were able to call everybody in. Okay, this is a what now moment. How are we going to inquire about this? What do we know? What don't we know? Very much like emergency responders deal, right? Quite confident in their capacity to know what they know, and quite humble in their capacity to know what they don't. And then entering into the unknown with an exploratory mindset. Certainly, as Christian said, open to something wonderful happening, but also open to the fact that we may actually need to be in the weeds for a while before that does, and that we can navigate both. And so I think that's enough to just kind of get it out there, and we can be conversational and chat about it. But what now moments and wayfinding in their wake is really what I'm contributing to the conversation.
That's great. Thank you so much. So much to unpack. And the chat was popping off there with lots of different comments and feedback and questions, which I will field in a little bit. But I just wanted to give Christian the chance to chime in there on any thoughts, observations, reflections before we take some questions, because there's been a few things that have come in there.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting, Joan, your work, especially around exactly those moments and how do we, in a way, perceive those moments? What do we do with those moments? I think one of the things that I've always found interesting and that comes out of a lot of the research we've been focused on is, I think a lot of times we see dichotomies where there might be an end, right? At both ends. So for example, let's say there might be, do we perceive something as either bad or good? Well, it depends on when we look at it, right? To your point, like if we look at a breakup in the moment of the breakup, it feels like the end of the world, existential. But then 2 years later, when we meet the real love of our life, it's like, oh, thank you so much that you broke up with me 2 years ago. Otherwise, I couldn't have found that love of my life. And so in a way, that's also the beautiful thing with serendipity, that there's a lot of times this incubation time where there might be an inflection point that's extremely negative. And yes, that needs that kind of deep, like existential, a lot of times it's very hard for us to go through it. And kind of that's a very tough moment. And like, I'm a huge fan that these are the kind of moments where it's not about rosy thinking and over optimism, but it's about accepting and like taking that on and accepting the pain and not running away from the pain. And then at the same time saying, okay, now over time, can I define that situation rather than have the situation define me? And I think that's what comes out a lot of the research we're doing that when you look at interesting leaders, they will always have a lot of inflection points in their life where things went really wrong, where something went really down the drain. And then they, at some point, when they found themselves, they were like, okay, great, now I can do something with this. And I try to use it in my story as a more active kind of thing going forward. And that's the last piece I was thinking about. I think a lot of times we think about, things like serendipity and related questions as kind of a nice to have, right? So, oh, great, like if you already have a good life, and then, hey, here's a bit more innovation, here's a bit more love, here's a bit more this and that. But actually, a lot of times, a lot of the serendipity we see, especially in the toughest of the tough circumstances that we've been studying, Cape Flats and Cape Town, for example, where out of necessity, people have to create serendipity to survive. Like, and even like during COVID here, right? When you're a brewery that was producing alcohol and all restaurants from one day to the other don't buy from you anymore, now, if you realize, oh, I can use my alcohol to produce hand sanitizer, you become a big hand sanitizer company. If you don't, then you don't. But it's out of necessity that you see those points. And so I'm a big fan of also seeing that a lot of times, actually, we can learn a lot from people in extremely tough circumstances of how they use the very, very small agency that was given to them to still then create out of dignity the things that are really important. And I think, to me, those of you just, I think, Claire, that's also something I know is close to your heart in terms of, and I think to the RSA in general, it is a society, right, that's about the betterment of people, like, and especially those who are less privileged. And so it's very close to my heart to think about how, when we think about development and helping others, it's so much focused on resourcing and things like this, but that a lot of times can actually take away dignity from people, right? If I go to you and say, hey, here's this for free, this is a handout for you, you might feel you failed, right? Because you didn't do that yourself. Versus if I have a job for you, you create that, and then you kind of can feed your family because you had your own job, then that's dignity that comes from it. So long story short, this kind of thinking is also a lot about saying, we need to enable people to create their own luck, because it's an agency mechanism that people want to create their own luck. It's a huge thing of dignity. And so I think, especially in those tough contexts, it's a necessity.
Yeah, and I'll build on that. First of all, what was very, very interesting in the work that I do is that threat response is not just if things go wrong, right? A lot of people who wind up in what now moments, it's because something wonderful happened. And so I'm not a big fan, actually, of talking about imposter syndrome, because I actually think that we've given a name to a what now moment. It really is just a moment in which a positive opportunity has placed us in a place where we have an unknown and feel that it is a threat. Right. And so the application of this notion, sometimes it happens when you have a couple who have been trying to have children for 3 years and finally have children just as one of them is getting a promotion that makes it that one person has to move and the other person doesn't. All good news. Promotions and babies. But it certainly calls people's identities and self-direction into question, right? So it's this uniformity of it. It does not have to do with whether it is a positive or a negative catalyzing interruption or disruption. It's that interruptions or disruptions where we are unsure about what to do next feel threatening to us. And there are many different ways that we conceptualize it in the literature. We've given many, many names to this kind of larger abstract concept of when I don't know who I am, when I don't know where to go, that makes me feel unsettled and lost. And as a result, I have a period of time that I feel unmoored. And that's why directional wayfinding, right? So how does one ground oneself and then begin to think about whether it's by seeking luck, whether it's by engaging curiosity, whether it's by engaging your growth mindset, right? There's many, many different methods and mechanisms out there for doing it. But the acknowledgement of, in that moment, I know I feel unmoored, and here is why. That in of itself proves to be incredibly helpful to people in regaining their agency, to recognize, I feel this way because I don't know. It makes sense for me to feel this way. Now, how do I want to engage?
Yeah, I'm like so much to unpack. and I just really want to give time to some of our attendees and participants here, especially Marla and Vanessa, who popped some questions in the chat. So I just want to offer you the space to come off mute and share your questions if you'd like to do that. So I'm going to pick on you, Marla, because I can see your face, if that's okay. So over to you.
Sure. Thank you both. That was very interesting. All the things that I think about all the time but can't really articulate because this isn't my area or whatever. But I was thinking about a couple of things. The serendipity, I think about Jung's synchronicity, right? And I have this happen to me all the time. It's like, whoa, how is it that I called this guy in New Orleans? The next day the phone rings and a job offer for me in Statesboro at a university. How did that happen? That's just weird, right? Those kinds of things happen to me all the time, but I go after them. I don't know how, I don't know, who knows? That's point number one. Thank you for that. And to address your presentation, Joan, thank you too. This thing about being unmoored and being lost, I feel that way every day, all the time. I don't know what I'm doing. And I come out of a tradition of psychoanalysis, which is, can be very dark. And I just feel like, we're driven by forces that are bigger than us, both psychologically and cosmically. Your childhood, your traumas, you don't know what you're doing, right? So when you say make a choice and do this or do that, sometimes you don't even know. You don't know why you're doing what you're doing. And it's like a train wreck. It's almost as if because of transference, because of repetition compulsion, to use for it just keeps happening over again, and sometimes in a very bad way.
Well, and I think we spend a lot more time in that space than we acknowledge. Because the notion is that when we're in that space, we've somehow done something wrong. At least for some people, that's how they process it. And I think that a lot of where my work has taken me is how do we not say it's good or bad or right or wrong, but just acknowledge that when we are there are certain tools and tactics and techniques and resources and manners of being that we need to develop capacity for. But because we tend to try to avoid it or get through it quickly, right? Both as individuals, and I work with a lot of companies working with their teams, right? We want that to move quickly. So as a result, we actually don't focus on it long enough to think about, well, what's really happening there and how might we equip people to better operate when that is the case? And I think that that's really what I find quite interesting is to open it up and recognize sometimes we're executing with a clear sense of where we're going. Sometimes we're unmoored and uncertain, and that it's just a different toolbox. It's just a different approach that we'll be using. Not it's good when I'm on track and it's wrong when I'm off track. On track and off track are just parts of being human.
Building on this, thank you so much, Marla, for sharing. It actually, your second part reminded me a little bit, and I asked my wife before if I'm allowed to share it. She's obviously, hopefully, most partners would say that about their wife, but she really is the most amazing person out there. And she has constant serendipity, but she's not always the most kind of optimistic or, someone who would say, oh, everything is always rosy or great. Right. So because I think a lot of times people assume you have to be so optimistic or like constantly be in this kind of good mood to then actually have serendipity happen. And one thing that I've seen with her, what she's extremely good at is she's extremely good at connecting dots. Like she's extremely good at, Marla, if she would talk with you, she would say, oh my God, you're working on psychoanalysis. So amazing. The uncle of my friend worked on this. I want to put you in touch. Or, and so it's this kind of like, she constantly thinks about, can I make one introduction? Can I contribute one idea? And that's the beautiful neuroplasticity then, right, of our brain, where our brain wires itself towards seeing those connections more. And I think that's kind of a beautiful thing in this place. But also, Marla, you mentioned this interesting phenomenon of synchronicity, right? And those of you who are interested in this, I highly recommend Bernard Beitman. He wrote a book about coincidence, and he looks a lot into this kind of synchronicity piece, which is exactly to Marla's point, this idea that there's these meaningful coincidences in time, right? You think of someone and exactly that moment you get a call, or you think of someone and exactly that moment you run into them in the street. And that's beautiful, right? Because so the conversation with Bernard was a lot around this idea that, yes, like it's very probable that these things happen out of probability, right? Because there's so many potential improbable things that could happen that in and themselves, they're extremely improbable. But because there's so many potential of them, it becomes pretty probable that some of them happen. And of course, we want to keep the magic of it. And at the same time, it's kind of probability that's also playing into it. But I found so fascinating that the way Bernie looks at it is he ventures far more out than I. Like I'm a nerdy scientist at heart, so I only go as far as I can have data. But he essentially goes out there and he says, hey, look, let me figure out how twins, for example, have kind of like, how they connect with each other differently and things like this. And so those of you who want to venture a little bit further into maybe the spaces that we can't really test or know a lot about because it's just kind of hard to get data about, but that actually are our lived reality, how we have a lot of synchronicity, I highly recommend Bernie's work, who's also a psychoanalyst and has a lot of experience in that. So highly recommend Bernie Bateman's work there as well. But for now, Mala, thank you so much for sharing, because I feel you also beautifully embed this paradox, right? That you can, on one hand, have a lot of synchronicity and serendipity, and at the other hand, not always necessarily feel that life is always just easy and like comes one's way. And so thank you for sharing that.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I'd love to hand over to Vanessa. I think you had one or two comments or questions there. If you would like to share, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you for a really great discussion. I really liked what Joan said about imposter syndrome. I've always felt that was a really unfortunate terminology because I quite often feel out of my comfort zone, but not really an imposter. And I definitely don't want a syndrome. So it was good to hear that. I also felt, Christian, I would have handed the money in at the cafe. But I was just interested in these periods of kind of flux where we're changing from one condition to another. How can we get our own resources? What can we be doing? I'm definitely in a period of flux of leaving a job, setting up on my own. And it's thrilling. It's also terrifying. What can we be doing to sort of gather our resources?
Well, I think, first of all, it's the perfectly right question, right? This idea of what can we be doing to gather my resources really is very specific to you and your circumstance and your context, right? So the resources that one person on this Zoom needs are different than the ones that another one does. So that pause, that stopping is really a quick assessment of your circumstance, right? Because for some people, they find themselves between jobs, and if they don't get a job by Monday, the rent's not going to get paid, right? So the notion of what resources, what timetable, how they're meant to approach it are going to be very, very different because there's an acute nature to their circumstance. I've worked with other people who maybe they could, I can have 3 months to make this decision. I have, right? So part of it is understanding, like, what are the temporal boundaries, if there are? What are the resource boundaries? I draw upon Michael Unger's work. He's really done tremendous, wonderful work on resilience. And I draw upon his definition of resilience. He talks about it less as bouncing back and emotional bouncing back, which is fine, but he talks about it, the ability to connect with the resources that we need, the emotional, physical, material, and social resources we need in ways that are culturally relevant to us. And I think that there's a tremendous amount there in answer to your question, is to really say, well, where am I emotionally? Do I need to gather emotional resources? Where am I socially? Do I need to be, whether it be networking or, gathering friends and family around, whatever it is? What are my material resources? What do I have to work with? What are the physical resources? And by doing that quick assessment, or giving yourself a little time, right? Depending upon how much time you have. Now you enter into a sense-making process. This is my circumstance. This is the map of this particular point of inflection. And now how do I want to approach the reality of what is true right now? And we often don't do that. We kind of move on what happened the last time I lost a job or what might happen, but take a snapshot of the circumstance. Again, that firefighter on the scene. They know fire, but they don't know this fire. You know job changes, but you don't know this job change because you're a different person than you were and in a different circumstance. So by taking the snapshot, you can begin now to think about sensible ways that you either get clarity or could find it. I hope that helps.
Thank you. That's really useful.
And perhaps wrapping up that point, I assume we'll have to wrap up the session, unfortunately, already, which is a pity because I feel it's one of those themes that we could probably discuss for for a very long time. And, we'd obviously love to continue the conversation. Please do connect on different social media. But, one last thought on this would really be this idea that exactly a lot of times other people might see more for us than we might see ourselves, right? So in a way, for example, let's say we are in this flux and like we're open to kind of whatever could be, and we might assume that we are the one who has to see what could come next. But actually, it might be a good friend who says, hey, this could be for you that you haven't even considered. For example, Michelle Cantos, a good friend of mine, she used to work in NGOs. And then at some point she kind of said, okay, I really want to move on. So she sent an email to 20 people saying, hey, just wanted to let you know, I'm currently reorienting myself in XYZ ways. Like, let me know if you have any ideas. Someone writes back and says, hey, I just came back from an interview marathon at a tech accelerator. And I recommended you that they should reach out to you. And Michelle's like, what do I have to do with tech accelerators? I have nothing to do with tech accelerators. I'm in the NGO space, but her skill set, her friend saw for her that her skill set would be perfect for that tech accelerator. Turns out she got the job in the tech accelerator and became a really successful manager in there. The long story short being that once we let people know a little bit, that's, being at hooks, being at kind of like a couple of ways of how we also inform others that we're currently reorienting, I feel can be super effective also to have this latent social capital that we all have become materialized and really doing a lot of things, and vice versa. We for others might see things as well. And that's the beautiful potentiality, I guess, of life, that there's so much out there that we might not be aware of yet.
Thank you all so much for your thoughtful comments, reflections, questions. It's been a really energizing conversation, and I think I'm going away with a lot of food for thought. If we have a minute left, so I'm going to quick fire around what your key takeaway is from this session, or what you want to leave this session, maybe an action you want to do, or something you're taking away into the rest of your day or evening. So feel free to pop that in the chat. I always love hearing what people's takeaways are from these kind of events. And in the meantime, just a very, very big heartfelt thank you to both Joan and Christian for giving your time today, sharing your expertise, your lived experiences, and being open to receiving emails or sharing your book, and connecting with people on Twitter. And for those of you who registered via Eventbrite, I will be sending out an email probably tomorrow, referencing some of the books that were mentioned during this conversation, or some of the things that came up, as well as the YouTube URL, so you can have access to that. And if you have any specific questions, or you want to connect with an individual from this conversation, just drop me an email. I'm claire.byrne@thersa.org, and I'm happy to put you in touch with folks, because I know this is joining the dots. So thank you so much, and making those connections. Have a great afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, and take care of yourself. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Take care.
Thanks so much.